Get started with OLAP. Create a new ASP.NET MVC5 application using a Component 1 ASP.NET 5 MVC Web Application template. In the Project Wizard, check Include C1 MVC OLAP Library. Click OK. This creates the project. Rebuild the project. Let's examine what the template has pre-configured for us. It has added the MVC and OLAP assembly references. The resources are also configured in the layout.cshtml file. It has the styles and script registered, the views web.config file has the MVC and OLAP controls namespace added. This helps with IntelliSense. The license.licx file has the license entries for MVC and OLAP controls. The project is ready to use any MVC or OLAP control. Let's add a model class. Right-click the Models folder and select Add Class from the context menu. Name the class Product Data. In this example, we create the product data class that has countrywide sales data for the product. And a function to generate data called getData. Close this class file. Open the Home Controller class from the Controllers folder. Import the model's namespace. Declare a model variable that holds data returned by the getData method of the product data model. Pass the model to the view. Save and close the Home controller. Open the index.cshtml file from the Views Home folder. Remove the pre-existing content from this view file. Declare a model variable for the product data. Create div elements with row class using Bootstrap Grid System. Add a pivot panel control with the ID set as panel and the binding set to the model. This internally creates a pivot engine. Inside another div element, add a pivot grid. Set its item source ID property to pivot panel by passing the ID of the pivot panel. Save and run the app. When the page is loaded, observe that we have a pivot panel with all fields returned by the model and empty filter, columns, rows, and values. Also, we have an empty pivot grid. Let's analyze the countrywide sales data. Drag the country field to rows, drag the product field to columns, and the sales field to values. We find the pivot grid is now populated with for all products showing sales data countrywide and their respective totals. We can customize the field setting by right-clicking on the pivot panel and selecting Field Settings from the context menu. Let's change the summary from Sum to Average and click OK. The pivot grid now displays average sales data. We can add more fields for precise analysis. Add the active field to rows. The grid now shows active and inactive sales data. We can choose to remove any field by selecting that field and choosing Remove Field from the context menu. Further drill down is possible to see detail data. Double-click in any cell to view detail data in a pop-up. Sort any column by clicking the header. We have seen how a user can create views by selecting relevant fields. It is also possible to predefine a view so that when the OLAP control is shown, a default view is available for the user. Let's see how to accomplish that. We clear the fields from the panel. In Code, we add row fields that have the country added items collection, a column field that has product added to items collection, value fields that have sales added to the items collection, and save the project and refresh the browser. We can now see that the OLAP panel is loaded with the above fields defined and the pivot grid is populated with the data. The pivot panel displays all fields from the model. What if we need select fields, and how do we set values to aggregate differently than the default sum? This can be achieved by defining pivot fields. In the code, set the Fields property of Pivot panel. Fields is a collection that can have multiple pivot fields in its items collection. Each item can have a pivot field or cube field. We add a pivot field and set its binding to country, and then add another pivot field with its binding set to product. Add a third pivot field with its binding set to sales and aggregate as average. Save the project and refresh the browser. When the page loads, we find that the panel has only those fields that were defined in code, and the values now has aggregation set to the average of sales.